Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven. We're joined today by Terry McDougall. She is an executive and career coach. She's a speaker. She's a best-selling author of the book. For those of you on YouTube, you can see it over her shoulder. It's called Winning the Game of Work, Career Happiness and Success in Your Own Terms. So I'll tell you a little bit more about Terry. After 30 years of corporate business experience, 15 of which were in senior management roles, Terry chose to become a coach in 2017. So Terry, congratulations. I guess it's been a few years in now, but thank you for being a guest here on the podcast.
Mark, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. And I also want to mention that Terry has a relatively new podcast called Marketing Mambo. So I encourage you to go check that out. So I hope that's been a fun experience hosting.
Oh, it's been a blast. I absolutely love it. It's so fun.
Well, good. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and I hope everyone will check that out. So we have all kinds of things we can talk about today, but first things first, as I know you're ready to do, Terry. What would you say is your favorite mistake?
My favorite mistake. Okay. My favorite mistake was, it's actually was a bit painful, but it's probably one that I learned the most from. When I was in my, 2 jobs ago, I worked in a marketing department for the head of marketing for a particular business, and I guess you could call me sort of his right-hand person. I was sort of the first person that he'd go to if he had new projects, and I worked really closely with him. Well, he left the company, and I had worked at that company for about 8 years, and I thought, I think I'm ready for that next step up. I'm going to apply for his position. And it actually took them a few months before they even posted for it, and in that time, I had sort of informally stepped up and was sort of leading planning efforts, interfacing with people in the business, so sort of the de facto leader of the group. When it came time to interview, I sailed through the first round of interviews with HR pretty easily. The second round of interviews was a panel interview with, I worked in a large bank, so marketing was pretty big. And the panel interview was with basically some people in other areas of marketing, and I knew them, but I didn't work with them on a daily basis. And I also did not do anything special to prepare for this interview. I just thought, okay, I work here already. I've already stepped up. I'm doing the job. I thought that I was the heir apparent. Well, I got into that panel interview. It'd been a long time, probably like 8 years since I had interviewed. And I went in and I bombed. I got the flop sweats. No. I was tripping over my words. And I think part of it is also a panel interview. That can be tough, right? It just feels like you're sort of on the interrogation line. But needless to say, I did not advance in, beyond that. And that hurt because I thought, gosh, I know this stuff. Even the guy who was running it before me relied on me for a lot of the ideas and everything of things that we did. Well, I decided that, okay, even though I'm eliminated from that, obviously I had a big gap here, that I wasn't presenting myself confidently. I had some gaps in my interview skills. And it's funny to think about this now because this was probably 15, 17 years ago, something like that. And I remember scratching my head and saying, I think there's something called a career coach or something like that. And this was even before Google. So I think I went on Yahoo and I was like, okay, career coach, let's see. There happened to be one in my town. I called her, and at the time I thought her rate was really high, but I decided and it's funny now because it's like a fraction of of what I charge, but I invested in myself. I spent, a while working with her. She really helped me recognize what I was going to need to do to move up to that next level, right? Talk about myself confidently, think about how I add value and how I can talk about that. Mentally promote myself to the next level. I actually went out and went on a shopping spree and sort of did a little makeover so that I would be viewed as somebody who was ready for that next level. Well, it ends up that the person that they eventually offered that job to turned it down. And I guess they just didn't have another candidate that was a good second candidate. So they started the process all over again. And interestingly enough, I applied again, and I didn't know if I would be, selected to interview, but I was. And it ended up that I went all the way through the process. It got down to me and an external candidate. I felt very confident. I can still remember sitting in the boardroom with the CEO of our division and his, two highest level executives there. So again, it was the panel interview, but I felt really comfortable. And unfortunately, I didn't get the offer. The other guy, the external candidate, got the offer. I think sometimes, they knew me, and I think they thought he was going to bring something new and fresh to the role. And of course, that hurt to be a two-time loser.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but were you still acting in that interim role?
Yes, there was nobody.
Oh my gosh.
There was nobody to do it. I was the senior most person in the department, and so I was doing it. But of course, it hurt. And then, of course, the day that I found out that I didn't get the job, I went out to lunch, and when I came back, there was a voicemail on my phone from a recruiter for a role that eventually I got the offer for. But during this time, I got another job offer, and I had another interview that was active with another bank. And so by, say 3 months later, I had 2 job offers, actively interviewing for a third. I took one of the job offers. It moved me here to Chicago for a job that was much better than the one that I missed out on twice. And so, I guess my lesson there is that really there's no mistakes. There's just opportunities to learn and improve. And certainly I'm so proud of myself that I didn't crawl into a cave and lick my wounds and say, I guess I'm just not management material.
No, right. My gosh. It sounds like there were lessons that you were able to take away from each of those rounds. I mean, you mentioned there were some trying to analyze why I hate to use the word bombed, but that's the word.
I did bomb. The first round I did. The second one, I think I did really well, actually. Getting to the finals was good. It's just I think they wanted something different.
Yeah. So that first time, if I remember right, you said you maybe took it for granted. You hadn't interviewed for a while.
I did.
You were in the role. You didn't prep, and I guess that's something you would caution people against today when you're coaching that.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm working with people, because I'm a career coach, so I actually tell people that there's really only 3 ways to add value. You either help the company make money, save money, or reduce risk. And had I taken that, used that as a lens and looked at myself and said, okay, what are the biggest accomplishments that I've done in the time I've been in this role? And I had been prepared to sort of like almost put myself on the table like a product and talk about myself, in a more objective way. That would have served me very well. But I went in saying, well, I know myself. I can talk about what I've done, but I couldn't talk about it in a way that was persuasive and demonstrated the value that I had added. I could just say, oh yeah, I did this stuff. But I think some of the, one of the lessons that I learned, and it was that even though I knew these people, they were in different parts of marketing, they really didn't know in any depth what we did in that department that I was in. And I wasn't really prepared to talk about that in a, sort of in a business case type way. And I realize now that they probably looked at me and said, yeah, we like Terry. She's nice and she seems smart, but, I didn't demonstrate it when I went into that interview. And I definitely took it for granted that people would see me the same way I saw myself, instead of realizing, I had to go in and make the case.
Yeah. Now, I want to maybe a question related to coaching that you're doing now. This question's outside my expertise, so I'll ask it, and I hope it's not a bad thing to ask. But you see news stories about the role of gender, as much as you can generalize.
Yeah.
Women talking, being less willing to talk themselves up, or the dynamic of men, generally speaking, are less afraid to apply for a job that they're quote unquote unqualified for. Between your experience or from what you saw in the corporate world or people you coach with now, can you generalize like that, or what sort of trends or differences do you see?
Well, it is a generalization, but I definitely see that women feel like they've got to do more things very well. And a lot of times men are a little bit more goal-oriented in terms of like, okay, well, what's the most important thing that I need to work on? And I'm going to sort of put the blinders on and focus on that rather than, and I'll speak for myself. I'm definitely recovering from this, but looking at the to-do list and feeling like I have to check everything off the to-do list rather than sort of triaging things and saying what's the most important thing I need to do, and frankly, what can I delegate to other people?
Yeah,
or not do.
And there's yeah, and when you think about interviewing process, the last time I went through a traditional interviewing process for a full-time job was over 15 years ago myself. And thinking of the interview panel experience, that's one form of unpleasant. I remember, I think it was a summer internship in college at a company where I went through, it must have been 8 or 9 sequential interviews, and I was exhausted of saying the same, of answering the same questions.
You probably
basically
got to a point where you were like, did I tell you this already? I've said this so many times today. Yeah.
A different kind of difficult, but maybe, it kind of goes back to a question around what should be the role of a panel interview, or is your coaching people, is that happening just as often today, or are companies taking different approaches?
I am not seeing, occasionally companies will do a panel interview, but in the people that I work with, most of the time it's a one-on-one interview. What you described is not uncommon, where they may have a few sequential interviews. I have had those days where one time I flew to California for an interview when I was getting out of business school, and I think I left the East Coast at like 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning and went to San Francisco, and I had to interview with like 7 people sequentially, and I didn't do well, because I was exhausted.
Sure. Yeah, it's a long day.
When I look back at that one, I'm like, I should have insisted that they send me out the night before, so that I was really rested, but I just didn't, I didn't really know that I could do that.
Yeah. And I think of nowadays, between the pandemic or just evolution of technology, there's probably the risk of a Zoom panel. It's easy to do technically. Whether that's the best approach for interviewing and evaluating, who knows? But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that part of the reason why companies would, why they use a panel interview to begin with, but also it's easy to do it with Zoom, is that it saves time. You've got more than one person seeing exactly the same thing, because certainly I've, I was in the corporate world for a long time, and sometimes, you'd have several people interviewing a candidate at different times, and every once in a while you'd end up with radically different perspectives on the candidate. Like one person saying, I think we found our person and I love them, and the other person saying, oh my gosh, please do not hire them. And I'm like, what was the big difference, right? Yeah. And sometimes it is open to interpretation in terms of like, oh, well, they didn't mean it that way, or I took that as humor or whatever, where somebody else might have said, gosh, that was, they answered that wrong. So I think that can be one reason why companies use it. There's actually something else that's happening these days, which it's becoming more and more common, which is asynchronous interviewing, where they'll say that means that they send you a link with maybe there's somebody on video, not live, recorded, asking you the interview, and then you go onto a system and you record the answer to it. And then it gets sent back, and they just, on their own time, are reviewing people's recorded answers to the interview questions and making a decision about who they want to advance to the next level, which, it's definitely becoming less and less high touch in some situations. I think in those cases it's probably more where they have to hire a high volume of people.
Yeah, maybe not at an executive level.
Right. No, not at an executive level. Definitely not.
Yeah. Well, maybe there would be a way in that system where you could save your recording and then just also use it on the next interview.
Possibly.
That probably wouldn't work at higher level jobs. That would not work. That would be a mistake. But so I want to bring it back though, Terry. At the end of your story, you said something effective. You don't like thinking in terms of mistakes or failures. Can you sort of elaborate on that thought? Is it a matter of words, or is it mindset? Tell us more about that.
Well, all of us stub our toe or trip every once in a while, right? But when you fall down, if you don't get back up, I consider that to be a failure. But if you do something that feels foolish, or you make a mistake, it's really what you do after that matters. And I'd say some of the biggest, even most humiliating things that have happened to me in my life have actually eventually yielded the best things. In the story that I told, I think the key part of that was me having the courage to really face my deficits and do something about it. It hurt. I thought highly of myself. And I didn't like looking at myself like a loser, and I especially, from an ego standpoint, I still had to see those people that I had the flop sweats with.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it's good. I don't hear you blaming anybody blaming the format of the panel or whatever else.
It was all on me. I wasn't prepared. Yeah. But I also, I hadn't been tested in a long time. And I wasn't, a lot of times when I'm working with clients right now, they'll be like, I haven't interviewed in 20 years, right? And like, how do you even test that? How do you practice? I actually have tips for how people can practice if you want them.
Sure. Go ahead if you don't mind sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I tell people to think back over their career, their last role, and come up with 10 or 12 success stories and to write them out. What was the problem? What was the action? What was the result? And how did you measure it? And practice them. Get them down so you can say them in 90 seconds. And those are your answers to pretty much anything that you get asked. You might want to think like, okay, well, what's one where they're going to ask me like, what's your biggest weakness? Right? Because if you come up with 10 or 12 stories, and then you can usually spin them to answer just about any behavioral interview question, which are the ones that are like, tell me about a time when, right?
Right.
And what I think that preparing in that way does is that it turns it from feeling like an interrogation where you're sitting there like, oh my gosh, what are they going to ask me? My hands are getting sweaty, to I have a presentation about myself, and I'm ready, no matter what they ask me, to present something that I've done that puts me in a good light. So it really changes the mindset, and you can talk about yourself in a way that's, you're less self-conscious, I think, usually.
Yeah. And so when you talk about getting back up after that interview, you got back up, you continued doing the job, you got back up again with some help and coaching to get back up and try it again. But I'm glad that having those experiences. How does that help you as a coach? Does it help you relate to people where they might be intimidated and think, oh well, my coach is perfect, she's never made any mistakes?
Oh yeah. I mean, in my book and in my coaching, I tell people I mean, if they want to hear it, I don't like say, hey, let me tell you about the time, but I'll ask them, I had something similar happen. Would you like to hear about it? And, I think that when you've got a story and it has a happy ending, it can be very inspiring for people, because then they realize like, oh, I'm just in the middle of the story. I'm not at the end of or I'm not at the end of this part of the story. And there's this saying, I don't know if you've heard this one, like, when you're going through hell, keep going. It's kind of that same thing. Like, you might be in a painful place, but you're in a transition from, one place to another. And if it feels uncomfortable there, don't just stay there. Keep going. Get out of it to the next thing. And it's probably going to be challenging and uncomfortable and so forth, but you'll learn. You'll become stronger because of that.
Yeah.
And, when the new guy started, who was, that was awkward too, because he was my competition. He came in and started picking my brain about all of the ideas that I had for marketing. And that, I was very cooperative. I'm professional, but deep down inside, it lit a flame. I was like, I was mad, because I'm like, okay, you get the job and you get the extra pay and bonus and all of that kind of stuff, and you're going to take my ideas. And I mean, it's his prerogative as the head of the department for sure, but it really lit a flame in me that, like, you're ready, like, go and get it, girl. And I did. And I did.
You did. You mentioned that biggest weakness job interview question that gets answered in cliched ways that I'm sure we've all heard of. But, I try to make sure this podcast is not the same sort of thing I try to coach guests in advance, at least through some of the notes. Like, please don't have a story where my favorite mistake is that I was just so darn successful. I mean, there could be some element that led to, some version of hell, but the point's not talking about the hell, it's the redemption story.
Yeah, exactly.
So I like what you said about you're in the middle of the story, the ending of it, hopefully has a happy ending. And that's where I've gotten feedback, listeners of this podcast series say, well, for being a show about mistakes, it ends up being uplifting. I'm like, well, yeah, I hope so.
Right, because if it was just like, I didn't get the job and it's 20 years later and I'm still doing the same old job.
Yeah.
That I just decided that I don't deserve, advancement. Yeah, that wouldn't be a very exciting podcast.
No, that would be sad.
So, that you brought up one of the biggest, issues that people have, or like fears that they have. Like, what if they ask me that? Like, what's your biggest weakness? I've got something that I advise people, if you'd like to hear it. I have recognized that for most people, their biggest weakness is their biggest strength overused. And a lot of times when you overuse a strength, it gets you into trouble. And so I recommend to people, like, think about a time when, maybe you're very detail-oriented, right? And you were so detail-oriented that you couldn't let that report go so that it was finished on time. So you tell the story of, like, okay, I'm very detail-oriented, and, this happened. This is, say my boss came to me and, had to like kind of rescue me so that we could get the report done. So what I've learned since then is that when I get a new project, I'll look and say, like, where might I need help? And then I'll line up that help to, like, maybe help me proofread or review so that I can finish it on time. And since that time, I've never been late with a report. So, because nobody wants you to tell on yourself or air your dirty laundry. When they ask that question, they want to know that you have self-awareness, that you can take feedback, that you're a big enough person to recognize that you're not perfect. And that's okay. Yeah. I mean, anybody that thinks they're perfect, there might be some problems, right? Because nobody is.
somebody who says they're the best at everything and they know the most about everything, that wears thin very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably not going to be a very good collaborative team environment if you got Superman on your team.
Right. Right. But what you described there, I mean, that there was a bit of a story arc again, where there was a redemption story.
Yeah, exactly.
Learning how to deal with it or mitigate it. Yeah.
Yeah. And, in interviews, you're just telling stories, right? People like stories too. And I think sometimes people think like, oh, well, they're here to analyze me. No. Like, and if you've ever interviewed people, the people that come in and are confident and they've got good stories and they wrap it up and put a bow on it at the end, you love them. The people that are like scratching their head, well, I can't remember if it was 10% or 15% increase in revenue. I could get you the report on that. You're like, who cares? We're not going to
just say 12 and a half.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Fine. So one other question I wanted to ask you, Terry, on this idea of mitigating risk or mitigating mistakes. When we had a chance to talk in our pre-call, we kind of discovered a similar view around preventing big mistakes by doing small tests of change. Can you share some of your thoughts on that for us?
Yeah. I mean, I think any time that you've got something, any project or any decision that you need to make, it's always important to look at both the upside and the potential downside, and really seriously look at the downside. I mean, I think some of the biggest debacles we've seen in the economy have been when nobody, thought that the stock market could go down or something like that, right? Like,
it's impossible for housing values to go down.
Exactly,
that was a bad assumption.
Or that nobody's ever going to default on a mortgage, right?
Yeah.
You've got to look at the possibilities of both. And if there are some things that you don't know about, there's some factors that you just don't have a line of sight into. Sometimes, the whole idea, I think it's like basically design thinking, right? Like, okay, let's take what we do know and let's run a smaller experiment and see what we learn by doing this. And a lot of times, maybe it goes great, and then you have the confidence to, go ahead and roll out a larger campaign or whatever it is that you're doing, or you learn something that's going to allow you to make that next iteration more effective.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine in the context of, let's say, a large bank or a large company that has sites all across the country, there are test markets and pilots and small tests of change for the sake of either validating or learning and making it better before a rollout. Yeah,
and we did talk about that the other day about a software platform rollout that was going to have a lot of integration with kind of the service aspect that was delivered in the local branches. And the leadership was very keen on this. And they wanted to do a broad rollout, but I was very nervous about that, the interface between what we did with the software and how the people in the branches were going to kind of deliver on their part of it. I had my doubts. And so I found a market where the market leader was amenable to doing what needed to be done to run the test. And, much as I feared, there were some breakdowns in sort of like the integration between what we did on the technology and what the human part did. And I was extremely thankful that I did it, that I went small, that I did a beta test, because had I gone large, it would have been a pretty epic fail. And I would have lost my job. It was hard, though, because there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure because they were only looking at the upside. And I was like, there's a possibility of downside here. And I saw what they were.
Yeah, as much as I value, and we talk about learning from mistakes, that doesn't mean all mistakes are equally good. So I've been fortunate to have been taught, this idea of, it's better to make small mistakes than it is to make the big one, that the small mistakes create learning that prevent the big, huge catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
And I mean, that's why we do test markets and focus groups, or, find, a lot of times whenever I was trying to do something new within the organization, I would find somebody who was, an ally who got it, right? Who understood what I was trying to do, because I knew that they would be a closer collaborator than if I tried to roll it out and include people that didn't get it or were resistant. Because sometimes when people don't understand why you're trying to do something new, whether it's conscious or not, they may actually sabotage the effort, right? And
right.
that can be really deadly from a career standpoint.
Right.
You don't take that human factor into consideration. So
Yeah. So I'm glad with the coaching work you do, we'll help people avoid deadly career mistakes. We don't want to start another podcast series called My Deadly Career Mistake.
No, we definitely don't
does
want
not
to do
sound
that.
like fun.
We do not want to do that.
No. So again, our guest today has been Terry McDougall. Her website, you can learn more about everything that she does for people at Terry, it's Terry, B. McDougall with 2 L's. I should just spell it. I'll put it in the show notes. TerryBMcDougall.com, my mistake. And again, her book is called Winning the Game of Work, Career Happiness and Success on Your Own Terms. So I hope you'll check that out. And her podcast is Marketing Mambo. Real quickly, what's the story behind the name? Why Marketing Mambo?
Well, quickly, I was talking with one of my clients who's a marketing consultant, and we got off on this sort of like nerdy marketing tangent, having a wonderful conversation that we both thought, wow, we're really talking about some cool stuff here. And she said, this would make a really good podcast. And I thought, I'm enjoying this, and I think I would enjoy doing it on a podcast. So I decided I wanted to do it, and then I'm thinking like, okay, marketing career insights, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, you know what? I want it to be fun. Like, what goes with marketing? And so I thought, Marketing Mambo, that sounds fun. And actually, Mambo comes from an African dialect called Yoruba, and it means to talk. It's actually, Mambo in this particular dialect, it's actually used in modern day slang basically to mean, hey, what's up? So that's kind of what it's about, like, what's up with marketing?
Very cool. Well, thank you, Terry, for telling the story, and I hope people will go check that out. So thank you for sharing your story, what you learned from it, and how that's helped you help others. So Terry, really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us today.
Mark, thanks for having me.